Traditional fMRI analysis relies on a strict division of labor, mapping isolated cognitive functions to specific localized regions. This anatomical model implies a rigid sequence where signals move from sensation to perception and finally to cognition. However, this assembly line logic fails to account for the fluid transitions of human mentation, such as the seamless dissolve from focused reasoning into mind-wandering, or the chaotic shift into emotional turbulence. Mental activity consists of an ongoing distributed competition among overlapping neural processes, rather than a sequence of isolated stages passing data between lobes. The hard boundaries of functional neuroanatomy represent artifacts of our measurement tools, masking the true underlying architecture of human thought. The Brain Kinematics Model, or BKM, proposes that the brain operates as a continuously fluidized field of memory consolidation. Within this active, low-coherent fluid substrate, localized structures occasionally freeze into set instability. These transient, phase-locked icebergs represent specific windows of high neural coherence. Conscious states occur when these distributed patterns achieve temporary stabilization. Consciousness manifests as a temporary structural condensation that emerges and dissolves within a fluid dynamical system. The brain processes reality by slicing it into discrete temporal frames, beginning with millisecond-long sensation frames at the bottom layer. These sensation frames function solely to partition raw incoming sensory input into manageable units. These fragments bind upward into perception frames, which integrate objects and events over several hundred milliseconds. Perception frames further integrate into cognition frames, which bind these perceptions into reasoning and narrative. Each stable strain arc in the brain has a finite lifespan before its coherence naturally decays. In humans, this physical limit constrains our pure conscious stability to a window of roughly 6 seconds. This fast, surface-level conscious loop runs in parallel with slower, deep-loop subconscious processes that cycle over hours and days. A single conscious thought exists as a momentarily stabilized tower of these nested temporal frames. Maintaining this structure requires a mechanism to prevent internal memory strain flows from bleeding into external sensory frames. This separation is handled by the partition function, driven by thalamic gating, PFC modulation, and cortical phase alignment. For an incoming signal to be integrated, it must align with the phase of ongoing internal cortical flows. Signals that arrive out of phase with these internal oscillations are suppressed, distorted, or delayed. This mathematical phase alignment filter creates the actual barrier between the external world and internal hallucination. We can map these interacting thresholds onto a unified 3D geometric space to visualize every possible state of mind. The x-axis represents sensory coupling, or S, measuring the system's connection to external input. The y-axis represents coherence, or C, tracking the degree of neural synchronization. The z-axis is strain, or turbulence, designated as T, plotting unresolved internal loads and drives. Focused waking occupies the high sensory coupling, high coherence, and moderate strain space, forming a narrow, stable iceberg of thought. Dropping the sensory threshold allows the mind to drift into internal imagery, creating the broader, more diffuse zone of relaxed daydreaming. In REM dreaming, sensory coupling hits 0, while internal strain pushes high, allowing internally driven attractors to dominate the narrative. Deep sleep exists at the origin, where both coherence and strain undergo total dissolution. Transitions between waking and dreaming occur when the system's coordinates shift across a spatial threshold in this diagram. Mental states manifest as phase condensations, driven to different coordinates by changing energy inputs and internal loads. This geometric model also defines where emotion fits into the cognitive system. Emotion arises as cross-layer turbulence, the mathematical friction generated between misaligned temporal frames. This turbulence bursts during a predictive mismatch, such as when a sensation frame contradicts the expected structure of a perception frame. Internal cognitive conflicts, where competing reasoning frames fight for dominance, generate this same turbulent signature. Latent memory pressure amplifies this friction from the bottom up, as deep, unresolved strain networks push into the misaligned layers. Depending on whether the system maintains coherence under this load, The turbulence manifests as constructive insight or destructive overwhelm. Feelings represent the conscious registration of the brain's predictive architecture failing and restabilizing. We can now reconcile this model with physical anatomy. Neuroanatomy provides hardware biases, a landscape of attractor valleys. The prefrontal cortex acts as the enforcer of high coherence patterns, stabilizing cognition, while the sensory cortex anchors externally driven patterns, granting them weight against internal flows. Distributed strain patterns compete for regional support from this hardware to achieve conscious expression. Cortical regions shape the landscape, but the physics of phase locking determines which pattern wins conscious access at any given moment. The final unification is the frame transition equation, governing the mind's evolution. The next frame's state is calculated from its own retention, sensory feed, and the deep memory field. These are then modified by emotional turbulence and the penalty of internal conflict. Because this process is heavily weighted by memory and strain, the final cognitive output represents a strain-balanced interpretation rather than objective truth. The mind manifests as a continuously calculating event, an emergent, transient structure riding a fluid sea of neural physics.